The smell of old paper still follows me. Even now, years later, I catch a whiff of it in certain rooms. That peculiar mix of dust, ink, and something faintly sweet, like decay dressed in preservation. It takes me back instantly, back to the small archive room at the back of the Kingdom Hall, where I spent over 2 decades filing the secrets that were never meant to see daylight. My name is Evelyn Harper. I am 63 years old, and for most of my adult life, I believed I was serving the only true God in the only true way. If you had met me 10 years ago, you would have seen exactly what the organization wanted you to see: a model witness, a faithful sister, a woman who never missed a meeting, never questioned an elder, never allowed a single doubt to take root in her carefully tended spiritual garden. I was born in the spring of 1962 in Cedar Falls, a quiet town in central Ohio where the seasons changed slowly and nothing much ever happened, or so it seemed. My parents joined the Witnesses when I was 7, and I cannot remember a time before the organization shaped my world. The Kingdom Hall became my second home, the brothers and sisters my extended family, the publications my only literature. By the time I married Harold Harper at 22, I had been baptized for 6 years and had already pioneered twice. I was, as they like to say, spiritually strong. Harold was an elder, dependable, soft-spoken, 12 years my senior. He worked as an accountant for a local firm and spent his evenings preparing meeting parts or making shepherding calls. We never had children. The doctors said it was unlikely, and Harold accepted this with the same quiet resignation he applied to everything else. Jehovah's will, he said, and I learned to believe it. Instead of raising a family, I poured my energy into the congregation. I cleaned the hall every Tuesday morning. I organized the literature counter. I hosted hospitality after the Sunday meetings. And eventually, when Sister Pauline Renfrew retired from her unofficial role as the congregation's record keeper, I was asked to take her place. It was 1994 when I first stepped into that archive room. The space was barely larger than a walk-in closet, tucked behind the second school classroom, with a single window that let in a thin blade of afternoon light. There were 4 metal filing cabinets, a wooden desk that had seen better decades, and a typewriter that no one used anymore. The elders gave me a key, a small brass thing that felt heavier than it looked, and explained that my role was simple: receive documents, file them correctly, maintain order. Nothing complicated, Sister Harper, Elder Raymond Cole had said with that measured smile of his. Just keep things organized. Some of these files go back to the congregation's founding. Precious history. I nodded, eager to serve, eager to be trusted. For the first several years, the work was exactly as described. Mundane, even. Publisher record cards, meeting attendance sheets, correspondence with the branch office, territory maps. I developed a system of color-coded folders and alphabetized labels that brought me quiet satisfaction. Harold sometimes teased me about my little kingdom, and I smiled because I liked the way it sounded. A small domain where everything made sense, where order prevailed. But archives have a way of revealing what people wish to hide. And secrets, I learned, do not stay buried forever. The first time I noticed something strange was in the autumn of 2003. I was reorganizing the oldest cabinet, the one that held documents from before my time, when I found a folder that had no label, just a manila envelope, slightly yellowed, with a paperclip holding together a thin stack of papers. Curious, I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter dated 1987. The handwriting was shaky, almost desperate, and it took me a moment to make out the words. A young woman, I will call her Sarah, though that was not her real name, had written to the elders about something that had happened to her, something involving an older brother in the congregation, something she called inappropriate and painful. She begged for help. She asked them to believe her. Clipped behind the letter was a single typed response. Matter handled internally. No further action required. I stared at those words for a long time. The afternoon light had shifted, casting the room in shadow, and I remember feeling suddenly cold. I told myself it was an old case, a different time, that surely things had changed since then. I put the folder back where I found it and went home to prepare dinner for Harold. But that night, I could not sleep. I kept seeing that shaky handwriting, those desperate words, and I kept hearing Elder Cole's voice in my head. precious history. If you are watching this, and you have ever been part of a high-control group, you know this feeling. That first crack in the wall you have built around your faith, that first whisper of doubt that you try to silence but cannot quite ignore. I was 61 years old, and something had shifted inside me. Something small, but irreversible, like a hairline fracture in glass, invisible until the light hits it just right. I did not know it then, but that unmarked folder was only the beginning. There were more secrets waiting in those cabinets, more names, more silenced voices, and among them, buried in a file I would not discover for another year, was a document that would change everything, a document with my own name on it. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that autumn, to the woman I used to be, and show you how the cracks began to spread. If this story resonates with you, I hope you will stay with me. Leave a comment below, subscribe if you have not already, and know that you are not alone. Many of us have walked this path, out of the shadows into the light. To understand what I discovered in those archives, you first need to understand the world I came from, and the people who shaped it. I grew up in a house where doubt was treated like disease. My father, Leonard Whitmore, had been a factory supervisor before he found the truth in 1969. He was a practical man, skeptical by nature, but something about the witness's message caught him at a vulnerable moment. My mother had just miscarried their third child, and the elders who came to our door spoke of a paradise where no one would ever lose a baby again. That promise sealed our family's fate. My mother, Doris, embraced the faith with the fervor of someone who had finally found solid ground after years of uncertainty. She threw away our Christmas decorations, our birthday candles, the little porcelain angel that had sat on her dresser since her own mother's passing. Pagan symbols, she explained when I cried over the angel. We do not need them anymore. Jehovah will give us something better. I learned early that questions were dangerous. When I asked why we could not celebrate my friend Patricia's birthday, my mother's face tightened in that particular way that meant I had disappointed her. Worldly people do not understand, she said. But you are different, Evelyn. You have been given the truth. Do not throw it away for cake and balloons. So I stopped asking. I learned to smile and nod, to parrot the answers from the publications, to bury my curiosity beneath layers of obedience. By the time I was a teenager, I had become so skilled at this that I no longer recognized my own doubts. They had gone underground, dormant, waiting. Harold Harper entered my life when I was 20 years old. He was visiting our congregation from a nearby town, giving a public talk about the importance of spiritual goals. I remember watching him at the podium, tall, thin, with wire-rimmed glasses and a voice that never rose above a measured calm. He was not handsome in any conventional sense, but there was something steady about him, something safe. After the meeting, he approached me at the literature counter and asked if I had ever considered auxiliary pioneering. That was his idea of flirtation. We courted for 8 months under the watchful eyes of both congregations. Our dates consisted of field service together, meals with chaperones, and long discussions about theocratic goals. Harold told me he wanted a wife who would support his service as an elder, someone spiritually mature who understood the demands of congregation life. I told him I wanted to serve Jehovah faithfully and raise children in the truth. We were both stating job requirements more than expressing love, but I did not recognize this at the time. We married in the spring of 1984 in a modest ceremony at the Kingdom Hall. My dress was cream-colored because white felt too worldly. Harold wore a brown suit. There were no bridesmaids, no groomsmen, no dancing at the reception. Just fruit punch, sheet cake, and a succession of elders offering counsel about headship and submission. That night, in the small apartment Harold had rented near his office, I learned that intimacy could feel like duty. I told myself this was normal. I told myself love would grow. In some ways it did. Harold was never cruel. He provided for me, respected my opinions on household matters, and never raised his hand or his voice. But he was also never fully present. His mind was always on the next meeting, the next shepherding call, the next letter from the branch office. I was his partner in theocratic service, his helper in congregation duties. But I sometimes wondered if he saw me as a person at all, or just another responsibility to manage. The news that we could not have children came in 1989, after years of trying and 2 painful miscarriages. The doctor spoke of scarring, of complications, of options we would never consider because the organization's stance on certain medical interventions was clear. Harold accepted the verdict with his usual composure. "Perhaps Jehovah has other plans for us," he said. I nodded and smiled and went home to cry alone in the bathroom, the water running so he would not hear. I channeled my grief into service. More hours in the ministry, more responsibilities at the hall, more meetings, more assemblies, more conventions. I became the sister everyone relied on, the one who remembered birthdays, not to celebrate, but to send encouraging cards, who brought meals to the sick, who volunteered for every cleaning assignment. I was trying to fill a void that nothing could fill, but I did not understand this then. I thought I was being faithful. Raymond Cole arrived in our congregation in 1992, transferred from a larger city congregation where he had served as presiding overseer. He was in his early 50s then, silver-haired and imposing, with a deep voice that commanded attention. The brothers treated him with a deference that bordered on reverence. He had connections at the branch office, they whispered. He had been to Bethel multiple times. He knew people who knew people. From the beginning, Raymond made me uncomfortable in ways I could not articulate. He smiled too much, held eye contact too long, asked questions that felt more like interrogations. When he learned I had taken over the archive duties, he made a point of stopping by the little room at least once a week. "Just checking on our faithful sister," he would say, his hand resting on the door frame as if he owned the space. I always felt relieved when he left, but I dismissed my discomfort as spiritual weakness. Raymond was an elder, anointed by Jehovah's Holy Spirit. If I felt uneasy around him, the fault must lie with me. Perhaps I was not humble enough, not submissive enough, not trusting enough of Jehovah's arrangement. I prayed for a better attitude and buried my instincts deeper. Harold admired Raymond enormously. They became close over the years, spending hours together in elder meetings, shepherding calls, judicial committees. Sometimes Harold would come home late, his face drawn, and refuse to tell me what had happened. "Confidential matters," he would say. "You understand." I nodded and served him dinner and did not ask again. Wives were not meant to know such things. Looking back, I can see how the system was designed to keep us all in separate compartments. The elders knew things the publishers did not. The circuit overseers knew things the elders did not. The branch office knew things everyone else could only guess at. Information was power, and power flowed upward, never down. My little archive room was a node in this network, a place where secrets were stored but never examined, filed but never questioned. The congregation itself was a study in controlled harmony. We had about 120 publishers in those years, a mix of longtime families and newer converts. The Morrisons had been there since the founding, 3 generations of faithful witnesses who occupied an entire row at every meeting. The Delgados had joined in the late 80s, a young couple with 4 children who were held up as examples of family worship done right. Sister Pauline Renfrew, my predecessor in the archives, had been baptized in 1951 and remembered when the organization still celebrated birthdays. She never spoke of this, of course. The past was always being revised. Among my closer friends was Margaret Holloway, a widow in her late 60s who had lost her husband to a heart attack 5 years earlier. Margaret had a sharp wit and a gentle way of saying things that bordered on subversive without ever crossing the line. "The brothers mean well," she would say after a particularly tedious meeting. "But sometimes I wonder if they have ever actually read the Gospels." I would laugh nervously and change the subject, but her words stayed with me. Then there was Nancy Chen, a younger sister who had converted in her 20s and brought an outsider's perspective that I found both fascinating and threatening. Nancy asked questions, real questions, the kind that made elders shift in their seats. She wanted to know why women could not carry microphones. She wondered aloud why the organization's predictions had not come true. She lent me a book once, A Secular History of Religious Movements, and I returned it unread because I was afraid Harold would find it. And there was Raymond Cole's wife, Shirley, a pale, quiet woman who seemed to shrink whenever her husband entered a room. I rarely heard her speak more than a few words at a time. She sat in the second row every meeting, hands folded, eyes downcast, the picture of wifely submission. I used to think she was simply shy. Now I wonder what she knew, what she endured, what secrets she carried in her own silence. The object that came to symbolize my transformation was not dramatic, just a small brass key. The key to the archive room. I had carried it on my keychain for years without thinking much about it. But after I found that first unmarked folder, the key began to feel different in my hand. Heavier, more significant. Every time I unlocked that door, I was aware that I was entering a space where truth was stored but never spoken. One evening, about 6 months after my initial discovery, I stayed late at the hall after the midweek meeting. Harold had gone ahead, assuming I was finishing some filing. Alone in the archive room, I began to systematically search the oldest cabinet. I told myself I was just organizing, but I knew, even then, that I was looking for something. I found more unmarked folders, more letters, more cases handled internally. Some dated back decades, some were more recent. The names changed, but the pattern remained. Accusations made, investigations conducted in secret, matters resolved without any involvement of outside authorities. There were codes I did not recognize, abbreviations that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. And again, Raymond Cole's signature appeared on the final documents. That night, I drove home with trembling hands. Harold was already asleep when I arrived. I sat in the dark kitchen for an hour, trying to process what I had seen. The organization I had served my entire life, the organization I believed was guided by God Himself, was systematically protecting something, or someone. I did not know yet how deep the rot went. I did not know that my own name would surface in those files. But I knew, with a certainty that settled cold in my stomach, that I could no longer pretend not to see. The cracks in the glass were spreading, and soon, very soon, the whole structure would begin to shatter. The months that followed my discovery were a slow unraveling, not dramatic, not sudden, but steady and relentless, like thread being pulled from a garment, until the whole thing begins to come apart at the seams. I continued my archive duties with the same outward diligence as always. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I arrived at the Kingdom Hall an hour before the meetings to organize files, update records, and ensure everything was in its proper place. The elders saw nothing different in my behavior. Harold noticed nothing amiss. I had spent decades learning to hide my true feelings behind a mask of spiritual composure, and now that skill served a different purpose entirely. But inside, everything had changed. Every folder I touched, every document I filed, I examined with new eyes. I began keeping a mental catalog of irregularities, files without proper dates, cases closed without explanation, names that appeared repeatedly across different years and different incidents. I did not write anything down, not yet. I was too afraid of being discovered. But I remembered. I trained myself to remember. The winter of 2004 was unusually harsh in Cedar Falls. Snow fell in thick blankets that muffled sound and kept people indoors. The Kingdom Hall felt smaller during those months, the congregation huddled together against the cold, and I found myself watching my brothers and sisters with a strange detachment. These were people I had known for decades. We had shared meals, studied together, knocked on doors side by side in the ministry. But now I wondered, how many of them knew what I was beginning to know? How many had seen things and chosen silence? Raymond Cole continued his weekly visits to the archive room. I noticed now how his eyes lingered on certain cabinets, how he sometimes asked seemingly casual questions about specific files. "Have you come across anything from the early 90s?" he inquired one afternoon, his tone light but his gaze sharp. "We may need to review some historical records for an upcoming visit from the circuit overseer." I told him I had not noticed anything unusual. He smiled, patted my shoulder in that proprietary way of his, and left. But my heart was pounding so hard I was certain he must have heard it. That evening, after Harold had gone to bed, I returned to the hall. I had made a copy of the key months earlier, a precaution I could not fully explain even to myself, and I let myself in through the side door. The building was dark and silent, the heating system humming softly in the walls. I made my way to the archive room by memory, not daring to turn on lights. What I found that night confirmed my worst suspicions. In the back of the oldest cabinet, behind a row of outdated territory maps, there was a section I had never fully explored. The folders here were different, thicker, older, some of them sealed with tape that had yellowed with age. I opened the first one with trembling fingers. Inside were documents spanning nearly 2 decades, reports of misconduct, written in clinical language that seemed designed to minimize and obscure. Internal memos discussing how to handle sensitive situations without involving worldly authorities. Letters from the branch office providing guidance on maintaining confidentiality and protecting the organization's reputation. And case after case after case of accusations that had been investigated, judged, and buried, all within the closed system of judicial committees that answered to no one outside. One name appeared with disturbing frequency: Raymond Cole. Not as the accused, never directly, but as the elder who handled these cases, who signed off on the conclusions, who decided what would be reported and what would be forgotten. He was the gatekeeper, I realized, the one who controlled what remained hidden and what might, under unfortunate circumstances, come to light. I spent 3 hours in that room, reading until my eyes burned and my hands shook. When I finally left, the first gray light of dawn was seeping through the windows. I drove home in a daze, arriving just as Harold was waking for his morning routine. He asked if I had slept poorly. I said yes, I had been restless, perhaps coming down with something. He made me tea and told me to rest. I smiled and thanked him and felt the distance between us like a physical weight. The question that consumed me in the weeks that followed was deceptively simple. What was I supposed to do with what I knew? I had been raised to believe that the organization was Jehovah's chosen instrument on earth, guided by Holy Spirit, incapable of systemic wrongdoing. Individual brothers might stumble, yes, we were all imperfect, but the structure itself was divinely ordained. To question it was to question God. To expose it was apostasy, the worst sin imaginable, punishable by complete social death. But I had also been raised to believe in truth, in justice, in protecting the vulnerable. And what I had seen in those files was the systematic betrayal of every one of those principles. I began to lose sleep. I lost weight. Margaret Holloway noticed and asked if everything was all right. I told her I was fine, just tired, just the long winter getting to me. She looked at me with those sharp eyes of hers and said nothing, but I could tell she did not believe me. Nancy Chen, meanwhile, had stopped attending meetings. I heard through the congregation grapevine that she had been marked as bad association for asking too many questions, for expressing doubts about the organization's handling of certain matters. Her name was spoken in hushed tones, a warning to others. I thought about reaching out to her, but I was too afraid. If I was seen associating with someone under suspicion, it would draw attention to me, and I was not ready for that. Not yet. The midpoint of my journey came on a Thursday evening in early March of 2005. I had arrived at the hall early, as usual, and was sorting through a stack of recent correspondence when I noticed an envelope that had been misfiled. It was addressed to the body of elders, marked confidential, and it had been opened but not properly logged. Inside was a report I was never meant to see. The document was an internal review of the congregation's handling of sensitive matters over the previous decade. It had been prepared for an upcoming visit from the circuit overseer and was clearly intended to demonstrate that all proper procedures had been followed. But what caught my attention was a section near the end, a list of cases deemed resolved, with brief summaries of how each had been handled. One entry read, Harper E. Concerns noted regarding excessive curiosity about historical records. Recommend monitoring. Spiritual stability uncertain. Possible flight risk. I read those words 3 times before their meaning fully registered. They had a file on me. They were watching me, and they had classified me as a potential threat. My first instinct was panic. I wanted to run, to hide, to pretend I had never seen any of it. But beneath the panic was something else, a cold, clear anger that I had never felt before. They were treating me like a criminal for asking questions. They were prepared to destroy my reputation, my marriage, my entire life, simply because I had noticed patterns they wanted to keep hidden. That night, I made a decision. I would not run. I would not hide. I would gather evidence, real, documented evidence, and I would find a way to expose what I had discovered. I did not know how. I did not know to whom, but I knew I could not remain silent. The weeks that followed were the most dangerous of my life. I began systematically photographing documents with a small camera I had purchased at a second-hand store. I worked slowly, carefully, never taking too many photos in one session, always returning files to exactly where I had found them. I developed a system for organizing the images, storing them on memory cards that I hid in a box of old sewing supplies Harold never touched. Meanwhile, I maintained my perfect facade. I attended every meeting, commented regularly, smiled at the elders, and told Harold that my health was improving. I even accepted an additional assignment, helping to organize the upcoming circuit assembly, as a way of demonstrating my continued spiritual commitment. If they were watching me, I wanted them to see nothing but a faithful sister going about her duties. But the strain was enormous. Every time Raymond Cole entered the archive room, my pulse raced. Every time Harold mentioned something he had discussed with the elders, I wondered if they had talked about me. I started having nightmares, vivid, terrible dreams in which I was standing before a judicial committee surrounded by men in suits who accused me of apostasy while my mother wept in the corner and Harold refused to meet my eyes. One afternoon in late April, Raymond called me into the back room after the Sunday meeting. My stomach dropped, but I forced myself to remain calm. He asked me to sit, then closed the door, a gesture that felt more ominous than it should have. "Sister Harper," he began, his voice smooth and measured, "the body of elders has noticed that you seem burdened lately. Is there anything you would like to share? Any concerns weighing on your mind?" I looked at him, this man who had signed off on so many buried secrets, and I felt something shift inside me. "No, Brother Cole," I said. "I am fine, perhaps a little tired, but spiritually, I feel strong." He studied me for a long moment. "You know," he said, "curiosity can be a dangerous thing. The scriptures warn us about those who go beyond what is written. Sometimes it is better to trust in Jehovah's arrangement and not dig too deeply into matters that do not concern us." "Of course," I said. "I understand completely." He smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Good. We would hate to see a faithful sister like yourself stumble over unnecessary questions. The archive work is important, but it requires discretion. Absolute discretion. Do you understand what I mean?" I understood perfectly. He was warning me, threatening me even, though his words were wrapped in spiritual language. I nodded and thanked him for his concern and walked out of that room with my heart pounding so hard I thought I might faint. That evening, I told Harold I was not feeling well and went to bed early. But I did not sleep. I lay in the darkness, thinking about everything I had learned and everything I stood to lose. My marriage, my community, my family, my elderly mother still alive then, still faithful, still believing her daughter was a pillar of spiritual strength. If I was disfellowshipped, she would be required to shun me. She would die believing I had betrayed God. And yet, when I closed my eyes, I saw the names in those files. Women who had asked for help and been silenced. Children whose accusations had been dismissed as misunderstandings. Families torn apart not by truth, but by the organization's determination to protect its own image at any cost. How could I stay silent? How could I continue to be part of a system that sacrificed the vulnerable to preserve the powerful? The answer came to me slowly over the following weeks as I continued my secret documentation and my public performance of faithfulness. I could not expose the organization from inside. The system was designed to prevent exactly that, to identify doubters, isolate them, and eliminate them before they could cause damage. If I tried to raise concerns through official channels, I would be destroyed. The evidence I had gathered would disappear, and my voice would be silenced along with all the others. I needed help from outside. I needed to find people who had already left, who understood how the system worked, who could help me bring my evidence to light in a way that could not be suppressed. The internet was still relatively new to me in those days. Harold and I had a computer, but we used it mainly for email and the organization's official website. I had been warned repeatedly about the dangers of apostate websites, those evil platforms where bitter former members spread lies about Jehovah's organization. But now I began to wonder, what if those sites contained not lies, but truths that the organization wanted to suppress? One night, while Harold was at an elders' meeting, I typed a search query into the computer with trembling fingers. What I found changed everything. There were thousands of people like me, former witnesses who had left for reasons ranging from doctrinal disagreement to personal trauma to exactly the kind of institutional cover-ups I had discovered. They had formed support groups, created websites, written books. They shared their stories openly, using their real names, facing the shunning and social death that came with speaking out. I spent hours reading their accounts. Many described experiences almost identical to mine. The discovery of hidden wrongdoing, the realization that the organization prioritized reputation over victims, the agonizing decision to stay silent or speak out. Some had chosen silence and regretted it for the rest of their lives. Others had spoken and lost everything, but found a freedom they had never known inside. Among these groups, I found one that specialized in documenting institutional failures and advocating for accountability. They had connections to journalists, to lawyers, to former members who had successfully brought cases to public attention. They were careful, methodical, and they understood the risks involved in challenging a powerful organization. I created an anonymous email account and sent them a message. I did not give my name or location. I simply said that I had evidence of systematic problems within a congregation, that I was still inside and afraid, and that I needed guidance. The response came within 24 hours. It was compassionate, practical, and clear. They asked me to continue gathering evidence, to document everything carefully, and to prepare myself for the possibility of exposure. They warned me that leaving would be painful, that I would lose relationships I had treasured for decades, that the organization would do everything in its power to discredit and silence me. But they also told me that my voice mattered, that the truth mattered, and that I was not alone. For the first time in months, I felt something other than fear. I felt hope. The final weeks before my exposure were a strange mixture of dread and determination. I continued photographing documents, now with renewed purpose. I began transferring files to a secure location outside my home, following the instructions I had received from my new allies. I drafted a timeline of what I had discovered, organized by date and severity, ready to be shared when the moment came. Harold noticed nothing. Raymond Cole continued his weekly visits, his questions slightly more pointed, his smiles slightly more strained. I performed my role flawlessly, even as I prepared to destroy everything it represented. One Sunday morning in late May, I arrived at the Kingdom Hall to find a note in my mailbox. It was handwritten, unsigned, and contained only 3 words. They know. Run. I never discovered who sent that warning. Perhaps Margaret, who had always seen more than she let on. Perhaps someone else who had noticed the elders' increased interest in me. It did not matter. What mattered was that my time had run out. That afternoon, I received a phone call from Raymond Cole. His voice was different now, no longer smooth and measured, but tight with barely contained hostility. He informed me that a judicial committee had been formed to address concerns about my spiritual attitude, and that I was expected at the Kingdom Hall the following Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock. I thanked him politely and hung up the phone. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and began to write. I wrote everything. The documents I had found, the patterns I had identified, the names and dates and carefully buried secrets. I wrote about Raymond Cole's role as gatekeeper, about the systematic silencing of accusers, about the organization's deliberate choice to protect its reputation rather than its most vulnerable members. I wrote about my own journey, from faithful archivist to reluctant whistleblower, and I addressed my account to the support group that had guided me through this process. When Harold came home that evening, I told him I needed to speak with him. I told him what I'd discovered, what I had done, and what was about to happen to us. I watched his face change as I spoke, confusion giving way to disbelief, disbelief to horror, horror to a cold, distant anger I had never seen before. "You have destroyed us," he said quietly when I finished. "Everything we built, everything we believed. You have thrown it all away for what? For the lies of apostates? For the truth, I said. For the people who were hurt and silenced. For my own conscience. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he stood, walked to the bedroom, and closed the door. We did not speak again that night. The Judicial Committee was scheduled for Tuesday, but by Monday afternoon, my evidence was already in the hands of people who would ensure it could not be suppressed. Whatever happened to me, the truth would survive. I was ready to face the consequences. I was ready to lose everything, but I was not ready for what I would discover in that committee room, the final revelation that would shatter whatever remained of my former life. Tuesday evening arrived with a stillness that felt almost ceremonial. The sky was overcast, heavy with clouds that threatened rain, but never delivered. I dressed carefully. A modest navy dress, low heels, my hair pinned back the way I had worn it for 30 years of meetings. I wanted them to see the Evelyn Harper they thought they knew. I wanted them to understand exactly who they were about to destroy. Harold did not speak to me as I prepared to leave. He sat in his armchair, staring at the television without seeing it, his face a mask I could no longer read. When I paused at the door, hoping for some final word, encouragement, condemnation, anything, he did not even look up. That silence told me everything I needed to know about the future of our marriage. I drove to the Kingdom Hall alone. The parking lot was nearly empty, just 3 cars belonging to the elders who would decide my fate. Raymond Cole's silver sedan sat closest to the entrance, gleaming under the security lights like a predator waiting in the shadows. The building felt different at night, without the bustle of congregation members filling its spaces. My footsteps echoed in the empty foyer as I made my way to the back room where judicial committees were held. The door was closed, but I could see light seeping from beneath it. I stood there for a moment, my hand on the doorknob, and took one final breath. Then I walked in. 3 men sat behind a folding table. Raymond Cole in the center, flanked by 2 younger elders I recognized, but had never known well. Brother Davidson, thin and nervous, who had been appointed only 2 years earlier. Brother Marsh, heavier and more confident, who ran a small insurance agency in town. They had notepads in front of them, pens poised, expressions carefully neutral. Raymond gestured to a single chair facing the table. "Please sit, Sister Harper." I sat. The chair was hard and uncomfortable, positioned so that I had to look up slightly at the men judging me. A deliberate arrangement, I realized. Everything about this room was designed to make the accused feel small. "Do you know why you are here?" Raymond asked. "I was told there are concerns about my spiritual attitude." He nodded slowly. "Concerns? Yes. Serious concerns." He opened a folder in front of him. My folder, I assumed, the one I had seen referenced in that misfiled report. "Over the past several months, you have demonstrated a pattern of behavior that troubles us deeply. Excessive curiosity about confidential records, questions that suggest doubt about Jehovah's arrangement, association with individuals who have left the truth." "I have not associated with anyone who has left," I said calmly. "We have evidence that you have accessed apostate materials online, that you have communicated with groups hostile to the organization." His eyes met mine, and I saw something there that might have been triumph. "Did you think we would not find out?" I said nothing. There was nothing to say. They had been monitoring me more closely than I realized. Raymond continued. "Sister Harper, you have been a faithful member of this congregation for many years. We do not want to see you lose your standing with Jehovah. If you are willing to acknowledge your errors, to repent sincerely, and to commit to avoiding further association with apostates, we may be able to show mercy. And if I do not?" The room went very still. Brother Davidson shifted uncomfortably. Brother Marsh's pen stopped moving. Raymond leaned forward. "Then you will be disfellowshipped for apostasy. You understand what that means. Your family, your friends, everyone you have known for decades, they will be required to treat you as if you no longer exist. Is that what you want?" I thought about Harold, sitting alone in our living room. I thought about my mother, frail and faithful, who would weep when she heard the news. I thought about Margaret Holloway, who might never speak to me again. I thought about all the relationships I had built over a lifetime, all the connections that would be severed with a single announcement from the platform. And then I thought about the names in those files, the women who had begged for help and been silenced, the children whose pain had been deemed less important than the organization's reputation. The decades of buried secrets, the systematic protection of abusers, the institutional machinery designed to crush anyone who dared to speak the truth. I looked at Raymond Cole, this man who had signed off on so much suffering, who had built his authority on the silence of victims, and I felt something clarify inside me. A decision that had been forming for months finally crystallized into certainty. "I have something to say," I said quietly. Raymond's eyes narrowed. "We are here to listen." I reached into my purse and pulled out a thick envelope, copies of the most damning documents I had photographed, organized chronologically, annotated with my own observations. I placed it on the table between us. "This is evidence of systematic cover-up spanning more than 20 years. Reports of misconduct that were buried, victims who were silenced, decisions made to protect the organization's image rather than the people it was supposed to serve." I paused, meeting Raymond's gaze directly. "Your signature appears on many of these documents, Brother Cole. You have been the gatekeeper of these secrets for decades." Raymond's face went pale. For a moment, his composure cracked, and I saw something beneath it. Fear, perhaps, or fury. "Where did you get these?" "From the archives I was trusted to maintain. The archives where you hid the truth. This is theft. This is apostasy. This is the truth," I said, and my voice was steady now, stronger than I had expected. "And it is no longer buried. Copies of everything in that envelope have already been sent to journalists, to advocacy groups, to people who will ensure that what you have hidden comes to light." The silence that followed was absolute. Brother Davidson looked as if he might be sick. Brother Marsh had stopped writing entirely, his pen frozen above his notepad. Raymond Cole stared at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not contempt, but something closer to desperation. "You have no idea what you have done," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "You have brought reproach on Jehovah's name. You have sided with the enemies of the organization. Your blood will be on your own head." I stood up slowly, gathering my purse, my hands no longer trembling. "Perhaps," I said, "but at least I will be able to sleep at night." I walked out of that room without looking back. Behind me, I heard raised voices, the scrape of chairs, Raymond calling my name with increasing urgency. But I did not stop. I walked through the empty foyer, past the literature counter I had organized for so many years, out the front door into the cool evening air. The rain had finally begun to fall, soft and steady, washing the parking lot clean. I stood there for a moment, letting it touch my face, and I felt something I had not felt in decades. Freedom, not happiness. That would take much longer to find. Not peace. There was still so much pain ahead. But freedom. The freedom of no longer carrying secrets that were not mine to keep. The freedom of having finally spoken the truth, whatever the cost. I got in my car and drove away from the Kingdom Hall for the last time. The days that followed my confrontation with the Judicial Committee were a strange kind of limbo, suspended between the life I had known and the unknown territory that lay ahead. I had pulled the trigger, released the evidence, spoken the unspeakable words. Now I had to wait for the consequences to unfold. The official announcement came the following Sunday. I was not there to hear it, of course, but Margaret Holloway, brave, loyal Margaret, called me that afternoon from a payphone outside the grocery store, her voice hushed and hurried. "It is done," she said. "They read your name from the platform, disfellowshipped for apostasy and causing divisions." She paused, and I could hear the emotion in her breathing. "Evelyn, I am so sorry. I wish I could do more." "You are doing more than you know," I told her. "Just by calling. Just by not forgetting me. I could never forget you." Another pause, longer this time. "I have to go. They are watching everyone now, looking for sympathizers. But please know, you are not alone. There are others who understand, even if we cannot speak openly." The line went dead, and I stood in my kitchen holding the receiver, listening to the dial tone until it turned to silence. That brief conversation, less than 2 minutes, would be the last time Margaret and I spoke for nearly 3 years. The cost of her courage was too high. She had her own family to protect, her own standing to preserve. I understood. I did not blame her. But the loneliness that settled over me in that moment was unlike anything I had experienced before. Harold moved out within the week. He did not rage or accuse. That was not his way. He simply packed his belongings with methodical efficiency: clothes, books, the few personal items he had accumulated over our decades together, and loaded them into his car without ceremony. "I have rented an apartment near the office," he said as he carried the last box to the door. "The elders have advised me to pursue a scriptural divorce. Apostasy is grounds." I nodded. There was nothing to argue about. Our marriage had been a partnership of shared faith, and I had shattered that foundation beyond repair. Whatever love had existed between us, and I believe there had been love, in its own quiet way, could not survive what I had done. "I am sorry," I said, not for exposing the truth, but for the pain my choice had caused him. He had not asked for any of this. He had simply believed what he was taught, served as he was instructed, lived the only life he knew how to live. Harold paused at the door, his hand on the frame. For a moment I thought he might say something, some word of understanding, or at least of closure, but he only shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on some point beyond my shoulder. "I do not know who you are anymore," he said quietly. "Maybe I never did." Then he was gone, and I was alone in a house that suddenly felt far too large for one person. The weeks that followed were an education in solitude. I had never lived alone before. I had gone from my parents' home to Harold's, from one congregation to another, always surrounded by people who shared my beliefs and my routines. Now those structures had collapsed, and I had to learn how to exist without them. I developed new rituals to replace the old ones. Instead of meeting preparation on Tuesday evenings, I took long walks through the neighborhood, rediscovering streets I had passed 1,000 times without really seeing. Instead of field service on Saturday mornings, I visited the public library and checked out books I would never have dared to read before. Histories, memoirs, novels that explored the full complexity of human experience. Instead of Sunday meetings, I sat in my garden with a cup of tea and listened to the birds, marveling at how peaceful the world could be when you stopped trying to convert it. The process of dismantling my old life was both painful and necessary. I went through my bookshelves systematically, removing the publications that had shaped my thinking for so many decades. The bound volumes of Watchtower magazines, the study books with their highlighted passages and marginal notes, the brochures I had distributed to thousands of strangers over the years, I packed them all into cardboard boxes and drove them to the recycling center. Watching them disappear into the machinery felt like watching a part of myself being ground into pulp. But it also felt like liberation. I kept a few things. A Bible, not the organization's translation, but a standard version I purchased at a bookstore, wanting to see the words without the interpretive lens I had been given. A handful of photographs from conventions and assemblies, not because I wanted to remember the doctrine, but because I wanted to remember the faces of people I had loved. A single Watchtower magazine from 1984, the year Harold and I were married, as a reminder of who I had been and how far I had traveled. The financial realities of my situation became apparent quickly. Harold had always managed our money, and I discovered that our savings were more modest than I had assumed. The house was in both our names, and the divorce proceedings would eventually force its sale. I needed to find work, something I had not done since my early 20s, when I had given up a secretarial position to pioneer full-time. I found a job at the Cedar Falls Public Library, shelving books and helping patrons navigate the catalog system. The pay was modest, but the work suited me. I had always loved the quiet order of archives, the satisfaction of putting things in their proper places. And there was something healing about being surrounded by books, all those different voices, all those different perspectives, freely available to anyone who walked through the doors. No gatekeepers, no forbidden knowledge, just information, waiting to be discovered. My co-workers were kind without being intrusive. They sensed, perhaps, that I was recovering from something, and they gave me space to find my footing. Linda, the head librarian, was particularly thoughtful. A woman in her 50s who had been through her own difficult transitions and understood that some wounds take time to heal. "You are doing well," she told me one afternoon, about 2 months into my employment. "Whatever you are carrying it with grace." I thanked her, surprised by how much her words meant to me. In the organization, praise had always been conditional, tied to meeting attendance, field service hours, visible displays of spiritual progress. This was different. This was someone seeing me as a person, not a performer. The response to my evidence unfolded gradually, in ways I could not always track. The advocacy group I had contacted published excerpts from the documents on their website, accompanied by analysis from former members who understood the organizational context. A journalist from a regional newspaper reached out for an interview. I declined, not yet ready for that level of exposure, but I provided additional documentation that supported her investigation. Stories began to appear, not about me specifically, but about the patterns I had helped to reveal. Other former members came forward with their own accounts, emboldened by the knowledge that they were not alone. Raymond Cole was removed from his position as an elder within 6 months, though the official reason given was health concerns. I heard through back channels that the branch office had conducted its own internal review and found his handling of certain cases to be problematic. This was not justice, not real justice, not the kind that involved courts and accountability, but it was something. A small crack in the wall of institutional protection. The hardest loss was my mother. She followed the organization's instructions faithfully, cutting off all contact the moment my disfellowshipping was announced. I wrote her letters, gentle, loving letters that made no mention of doctrine or disagreement, but they were returned unopened. I called her on her birthday, hoping she might answer without checking the caller identification, but she hung up the moment she heard my voice. She died 18 months after my disfellowshipping, and I learned of her passing through a distant cousin who had left the organization years earlier. I was not permitted to attend the funeral. I was not permitted to grieve with the family I had known my entire life. That grief nearly broke me. For weeks after her death, I could barely function. I called in sick to work, stopped eating properly, spent hours sitting in the dark, remembering her face, her voice, the way she had held my hand when I was a child and afraid of thunderstorms. I had known that leaving would cost me relationships. I had not fully understood that it would cost me the chance to say goodbye. But even in that darkness, something sustained me. The knowledge that I had told the truth. The letters I received from strangers who had read about my story and recognized their own experiences in it. The small community of former members I was slowly building connections with. People who understood the particular grief of losing a family that was still alive. Of mourning a community that had chosen to forget you. One evening, about a year after my disfellowshipping, I received an email from a woman named Sarah. She did not give her last name, but she told me that she had been one of the people whose case files I had discovered in the archives. She had been silenced decades ago, told that her accusations were unfounded, pressured to forgive and forget. For years, she had believed that she was the only one, that her experience was an aberration rather than a pattern. When I read what you found, she wrote, I cried for 3 days, not from sadness, from relief. Finally, someone believed me. Finally, someone said out loud what I had known all along. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for giving me back my voice. I read that email 100 times. I printed it out and kept it in a drawer beside my bed. On the nights when loneliness threatened to overwhelm me, when I questioned whether the cost of truth had been too high, I would take out that letter and remember why I had made the choice I made. Some prices are worth paying. Some truths are worth telling. And some voices, once silenced, deserve to be heard again. 5 years have passed since I walked out of that kingdom hall for the last time. 5 years since I spoke the truth that cost me everything I had known. 5 years of rebuilding a life from the fragments of the one I left behind. I am 68 years old now, and I live in a small apartment on the east side of Cedar Falls, above a bakery that fills my mornings with the smell of fresh bread. It is a modest space. 1 bedroom, a kitchen barely large enough for a table, a living room where I keep my books and a comfortable chair by the window. But it is mine, purchased with money I earned myself, decorated according to my own taste, filled with silence that I have learned to cherish rather than fear. The divorce from Harold was finalized 3 years ago. We divided our assets with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized our marriage. Two people untangling 30 years of shared life as if dismantling a business partnership. I do not know where he lives now, or whether he is remarried, or whether he ever thinks about the woman he once promised to love until paradise came. Perhaps it is better not to know. Some chapters need to close completely before new ones can begin. My days have a rhythm now, different from the rigid schedule that once governed my existence, but satisfying in its own way. I work at the library 3 days a week, surrounded by books and the quiet hum of people seeking knowledge. I volunteer at a local community center on Saturdays, helping to organize their archives, a skill, it turns out, that transfers well to secular contexts. I attend a small non-denominational church on Sunday mornings, not because I have found new certainty about God, but because I have found community, and that is enough for now. The garden behind my apartment building has become my sanctuary. The landlord, a gentle widower named Frank, who lost his wife to cancer several years ago, gave me permission to plant whatever I liked in the neglected patch of earth beside the parking lot. I have filled it with tomatoes, peppers, herbs, and flowers, marigolds and zinnias and sunflowers that turn their faces toward the light. There is something profoundly healing about putting seeds in the ground and watching them grow, about nurturing life without expecting anything in return except the simple miracle of existence. Last spring, I received a letter that I had not expected. It was from Margaret Holloway, my old friend from the congregation, written on pale blue stationery in her careful, elegant script. She had been disfellowshipped herself, she wrote, for conduct unbecoming a Christian, a phrase that could mean almost anything, but in her case meant that she had been caught meeting secretly with her daughter, who had left the organization years earlier. The elders had given her a choice: cut off contact with her own child or face expulsion. She had chosen her daughter. I thought of you often over these past years, she wrote. I thought of your courage, your willingness to sacrifice everything for the truth. I was not as brave as you. I stayed silent when I should have spoken, but perhaps it is never too late to choose differently. We met for coffee a week later at a small cafe downtown where neither of us was likely to encounter anyone from our former lives. Margaret looked older than I remembered, her hair fully gray now, lines around her eyes that spoke of grief and difficult decisions. But there was something lighter about her too, a freedom in her movements that I recognized from my own transformation. I do not regret it, she said, stirring sugar into her cup, losing the congregation, the friends, even the faith I thought I had. None of it compares to holding my granddaughter for the first time, to watching my daughter's face when she realized I had chosen her. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. That is what they never understand, I said. Love is not supposed to be conditional. Family is not supposed to be a weapon. She nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. How did you survive it, Evelyn? Those first months, when everything fell apart. I thought about the question for a long moment. One day at a time, I said finally, and by remembering why I made the choice I made, not for revenge, not for anger, but because some truths are too important to bury and some voices deserve to be heard. We sat together for 2 hours that afternoon, two old women sharing stories of loss and liberation, of grief and unexpected grace. When we parted, we made plans to meet again the following week, and the week after that. Margaret has become one of my closest friends in this new life, a fellow traveler on a road neither of us expected to walk. The evidence I gathered has continued to have effects I could not have predicted. 2 years ago, a documentary filmmaker contacted me about including my story in a project about institutional accountability. I agreed to participate, though I insisted on using a pseudonym to protect what little remained of my privacy. The film aired on a streaming platform last fall, and the response was overwhelming. Thousands of comments from people around the world who recognized their own experiences in the patterns I had helped to expose. I still receive letters and emails from strangers who have found their way to my story. Some are from former members seeking advice on how to leave. Some are from family members trying to understand why their loved ones remain trapped in high-control groups. Some are simply expressions of gratitude, brief messages from people who felt less alone after hearing that someone else had walked this path before them. Each of those messages reminds me that truth has power beyond what we can measure. A single voice, speaking honestly about what it has witnessed, can ripple outward in ways we never anticipate. I did not set out to start a movement or become a symbol. I only wanted to stop carrying secrets that were poisoning my soul. But sometimes the simplest acts of honesty become something larger than ourselves. This morning, I woke early and walked to my garden as the sun was rising. The air smelled of damp earth and the roses that have finally begun to bloom along the back fence. A cardinal was singing somewhere in the branches of the old oak tree, its song clear and bright against the morning stillness. I stood there for a long time, my bare feet cool against the grass, feeling the warmth of the new day slowly spreading across my skin. I thought about the woman I used to be, faithful, frightened, so desperate to belong that she buried her own conscience beneath decades of obedience. I thought about the woman I have become, scarred certainly, and sometimes still lonely, but free. Free to think my own thoughts, free to ask my own questions, free to love without conditions and speak without fear. The journey between those two women was the hardest thing I have ever done. But standing in my garden this morning, watching the light spread golden across the flowers I planted with my own hands, I knew with absolute certainty that I would make the same choice again. Some cages are invisible, some prisons have no walls, and some freedoms can only be found by those brave enough to walk away from everything they thought they knew. My name is Evelyn Harper. I am 68 years old, and I am finally, fully free. This is a true story, shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us. If you also have a story you would like to share, write in the comments. We will be very happy to tell your story on our channel.